Hi, everyone. As you know, my name is Kelly Shevchik, and right now I currently teach fourth grade math. I have also previously taught third grade, fifth grade, and sixth grade. Although when I did teach sixth grade, I had a reading focus, and that was a long time ago. So I've been teaching math now for about 10 years, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about a day in the life of a fourth grade math teacher. Okay, here we go. Okay, so what does a fourth grade math teacher actually teach? And I try to categorize the largest units, what we spend the most time on. So to begin, there's geometry. Fourth grade is a very heavy year in geometry. We learn things such as identifying and drawing lines, line segments, rays, points, angles. We also distinguish between acute, obtuse, and right angles, and students need to be able to draw those, measure those, and recognize them just using the naked eye. We also focus on knowing the difference and being able to identify parallel and perpendicular lines. Those are in isolation and also when you're looking at different two-dimensional figures. Students have to be able to classify two-dimensional figures. So not only do they need to know that a four-sided figure is called a quadrangle or quadrilateral, they then take it a step further and have to classify them based on if there's one pair of parallel sides, two, and different things like that. So kites, diamonds, parallelograms, squares, rectangles, being able to differentiate and distinguish between all of those figures and symmetry, which is probably the most fun part of geometry for the kids, because you can do a lot of art projects to show that a line of symmetry, you have to have the exact same thing on both sides. That's also a good one to get outside and look for things in our real world in nature that have symmetry. In fourth grade, students also generalize and analyze patterns. So you're looking at number patterns, shape patterns, and function tables. They need to be able to look at a function table, and that's like an in and out box, or if you've never seen one of those, it's like where you have numbers on one side and the other. And it's also like, what do you put in the inside? You have to come up with a rule. So if you have a 4 going in, when you're looking at the outside, if there's an 8, you first of all recognize the number's getting bigger. So the rule is either being able to multiply or add. Then you have to check every inside with the out to determine what the rule or function is. So they have to identify the missing elements in those tables as well as determining the rule. Moving on, numbers and operations in base 10 and fractions. So fourth grade focuses on all 4 operations, adding and subtracting big numbers. Those are usually not taught in isolation unless it's a remediation. Those are buried in multi-step word problems. Distinguishing the difference between factors and multiples and identifying both of those, comparing very big numbers and putting them in order, and rounding numbers. One question was, what's the hardest thing that I feel to teach in fourth grade math is, and I would say fractions. There's a lot of fractions. Students need to be able to compose and decompose fractions, identify unit fractions, recognize and generate equivalent fractions, with then goes deeper into adding and subtracting fractions with common and uncommon denominators. So they need to know how to make the equivalent fractions. Students have to be able to compare fractions and order fractions when they have different denominators. And that is what I think is the hardest, because a lot of kids, unless you're given a visual, have a very hard time understanding why a fraction with bigger numbers might be smaller, and it all depends on what the numerators and denominators are. And we also relate fractions to decimals, and that's really the introduction to decimals for children, looking at a fraction with tenths and hundredths, and then relating that to base 10 block with tenths and hundredths, and then going to the right side of a place value chart, which they've never experienced. In a place value chart up to this point, they've talked about ones, tens, hundreds, the whole way up to millions. This is the first year where they talk about numbers beyond the decimal point, and we only go to tenths and hundredths. Do we use manipulatives in fourth grade? Absolutely. When we're introducing new concepts, we use manipulatives. We use them as teaching aids and also when playing games. I listed the ones that I thought probably were the most popular for a fourth grader. Still using number lines, maybe not to count unless that's like an adaptation for someone. But when we're rounding numbers, we use number lines, comparing and ordering numbers and fractions. Counters can be used in fractions for games, for adding and subtracting. Base 10 blocks will be recognizing place value and also adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing. Pattern blocks are very commonly used with geometry units as well as looking at fractions. So if you take a pentagon and then you have 5 triangles, you can then show that like a triangle would be 1/5 of a pentagon. And that kind of, if you don't have fraction circles, that's when you use the pattern blocks. We use dice for playing games, and sometimes if you want to do some probability, and also using place value charts a lot for recognizing values of numbers, comparing numbers, introducing decimals. I always have a place value chart for kids to use as a teaching aid. Some of my favorite online resources. Extra Math is a great resource to use daily because it's a very quick tool. It starts kids at addition and they have to beat the teacher and they do addition practice and then they move on to subtraction, multiplication, and division. All basic facts. Once they pass, then it knocks the time down. So then they have to get, it goes down to like 3 seconds, 2 seconds, 1.5 second, and then 1 second. So even if they are progressing quickly, when they have to be very fast, that takes a little bit longer. So it really shows who has their facts memorized and are very automatic, and you don't really have to think about it. Khan Academy is a free program that's actually excellent to use for individualizing instruction because you can assign whatever lesson you want for the kids. So sometimes it can be a remediation, it could be a preview, a great way to enrich kids because if you are adding fractions and you have a group of kids who are secure in that skill, you can move to the 5th grade standard and find adding more difficult degrees of adding fractions, and there are helping videos and teaching videos included. So they are getting instruction first, and then there's practice portions where you do receive a score on the lesson for the child. It also has some incentives where they create an avatar and earn coins, and then they can like level up and play different games. Brain Pop Junior, that is unfortunately a paid resource, but there's a Brain Pop and a Brain Pop Junior. Has so many different topics: reading, writing, holidays, seasons, math, science, social studies, with attached quizzes and activities. Very high interest for kids also. As dorky as it may sound, the SAS website is also an excellent resource for if you are given a standard that you need to develop a lesson with and you might not know the class or you haven't worked with the kids yet. If you have an interview and they tell you that you need to teach a 3rd grade lesson on and they give you the standard, great place to look at the standard, look at what comes before the standard. So there's your almost your anticipatory set, the prerequisite, what comes after if you need to have an enrichment also, and then also gives you explicit questions for that standard so that you can see like what does it really mean, even if it's like in reading, main idea and details. So what does that mean to a 2nd grader if it's a 2nd grade standard? So you can see very specific examples, and there's also resource tools on the SAS website listed by standard for you to go to and use. Kahoot, which used to be one of my favorites, now that they've taken away all of the pre-made Kahoots, it's a little bit more difficult to use on a very quick basis, but not hard to learn. It is an online resource where you can develop quiz questions, practice questions, and then the kids log on their device, and the question is shown to everyone, and there's 4 options, and they have to pick which one answers the question, very high interest, very engaging, and very competitive, because the quicker you get the answer, the more points you get. And it does show a leaderboard. I believe top 3 get to be on the podium at the end. And then Nearpod, which that is new to me this year. It has been an excellent resource in teaching online, because normally in the classroom, you can walk around and see what the kids are writing. On Nearpod, they have the ability to, if you're shading fraction pieces, you put it on your screen and they actually shade from their computer, and then you can see what everyone has done. If you're doing addition problems, they can actually solve the problem on the screen, and then you can follow along with their thinking. Okay, so those are not nearly a whole list, but I would say those are the ones that I find myself using the most. 4th grade PSSAs. In elementary, students take PSSAs in 3rd grade, 4th grade, and 5th grade. In 4th grade, they take math, reading, and science. It is the first year where they have an answer booklet and a testing booklet. So you are responsible for teaching them how to take the test, reminding them that, if you're on number 4 in your answer booklet, you need to be on question number 4 in your testing booklet, making sure all your answers get transferred into the answer booklet and not in your test booklet. Some very simple things, such as not putting, because all year we practice good test taking skills. I do not shut down and teach how to take the test. Do we do practice sometimes? Of course. But years ago, about a month before the test, we would stop and practice. It just seemed silly, and it was boring, and the kids hated it. So now we sprinkle it in all year. So every time I read a problem, we read it together. We get the gist of it, come up with a plan, highlight important words, eliminate the answer choices that we know are not correct. So you want to make sure that in the test booklet, they're eliminating the answers. If they're putting X's on the bubbles in the answer booklet, the computer will not read that question and it will count as being wrong. So little things like that. Something great for the PSSA math is that, except for the first 5 problems, they complete those 5 problems with no calculator, just scratch paper. Then you have a red circle sticker. You take those together. The rest of the test, they can use a calculator on the rest of the test. I encourage them to try solving on their scratch paper and checking with the calculator, but with the scientific calculators, they can even put those fractions in there. So the test becomes not so much the arithmetic part, but it's really the math thinking. Can they listen to these word problems, read these word problems, and determine what plan of action they need to take to solve the problem? And all of the math can be read aloud, all questions and options. What are my feelings on Eureka Math? So I made my list of pros and cons. Some pros were that I did learn some new ways of thinking, different ways to use a place value chart for regrouping and multiplying and dividing. There is a lot of repetition. Sometimes I feel like it's a little too much. I had to skip probably at least 20 equivalent fraction lessons because they were never ending. One other thing I really liked is that there are videos for online instruction that the students can watch before you really sit down and work with them. To host an online class in the same way you would a face-to-face class, I feel like you would lose the kids, because I have an hour and a half for math, and that's a long time for a child to be sitting on the screen when they still have reading and other subjects to do within the day also. Some of the cons, I feel that it's not rigorous enough. Too many of the skills are taught in isolation and practiced in isolation, and not in the way that the state is requiring kids to think. They will have just a whole list of adding fractions instead of them having to read a problem and decide that the measurements in there, if there's 5/8 of yarn, 5/8 feet of yarn, 8/9 of yarn, and 5/10 of yarn, how much yarn do you have all together? It will just give the basic fraction. So it doesn't require them to really dig as deep or problem solve as much. And the problems also do not mimic the types of the questions on the PSSAs. And while I will say you don't want to teach the test, you do want to practice in the amount of rigor, in the amount of deep thinking that the test the students, because in the end, if that's what your district is using to gauge your teaching, gauge your program that you're using, you want to be practicing that all year, like I said, just so you're not stopping a month before and cramming for the test. One last thing is I don't believe that there's enough assessments. Yes, there are exit tickets for each week. I'm sorry, for each lesson, but they're not to the depth of a true assessment. And then it waits till the end, and then the assessment is huge. So I prefer personally to have more smaller assessments throughout a unit, and then maybe take one big assessment at the end. But I wasn't a big fan of how that was arranged. What is something I wish I knew before I started teaching? First and foremost, when I started teaching, it's much like buying a house. I'm talking about myself personally. When I got my first classroom, I wanted everything in the room to be perfect. The borders, the bulletin boards, student desks, supplies. I opened up a credit card and probably put $5,000 in supplies for my classroom on the credit card because I wanted everything to be perfect. It took me probably my first 8 years of teaching to pay off the credit card. Was it worth it? No. I would say get your necessities. And when you're new to a building, people are going to give you a lot of things. See what you need first. Don't put yourself into debt just because you want things to be perfect. I've also learned that instead of making all my pre-made bulletin boards, I do an outline and then I use the students and I put their work up there. I put their faces up there. I use their input. I use the walls for behavior things, more of useful space as opposed to pretty and cute looking spaces. Another thing that I've realized is you get a knowledge and exposure, hopefully background information in college. You really don't learn anything until you really get into the classroom. There's so much data analysis that comes with teaching. I've learned so much in terms of how to look at data, use data to inform my instruction, and also staying current with what are not new ways to teach math, but new strategies, new websites, new programs to use that are staying current with the state standards. So those are things that I just didn't realize how much time it takes and how much thinking and planning it takes to be a teacher. And, it's not all bulletin boards and art projects and singing songs and playing games with the kids. It's much, much more. How do I incorporate reading into math? Well, we read every day. I do use mentor text a lot to review, to introduce skills. Every time we read a word problem, we go back and we close read, which is a reading skill. So we read the problem to get the gist of it. Then we go back and pick out the important information and read, and reread the problems until we can come up with a plan. We also practice reading skills with all the words problems with using a highlighter, just like I said, important, planning out the important things and coming up with a game plan to solve. How would I describe my teaching style? Hard work really pays off. I kind of made this little timeline. September and October, my teammate and I really use that as boot camp. We drill rules, procedures, routines. We're very firm, very strict. The first 2 months of school, I hate them every year. I feel like I'm really mean because I am very firm. With my behavior plans, when students bring back agendas that aren't signed, there is a consequence. When homework isn't completed, there is a consequence. And they get sad and they get, they're sometimes used to getting a lot of chances. And I don't want to say it's one chance and you're out. There are many chances, which I'll kind of talk about with my behavior plan, but I feel like I'm very, very, very firm and strict September and October. which I don't like it because I get a lot of emails and a lot of notes from parents. My daughter's scared because she didn't have her work done. My daughter's nervous she's going to get in trouble. And I think that's where you develop your respect, because I do have high expectations, which kind of comes in through November through February. It's not that I let up completely, but that's when I practice what I preached in September and October. So I keep my high expectations. They know what's expected of them, and I try to stick to it as much as I can. Are there exceptions sometimes? Absolutely. However, it's kind of what I try to keep and remind myself of. And then if I'm strong in September, October, November, December, January, and February, because usually in January you kind of have to go back to that boot camp mode a little bit, because Christmas is a crazy month and a crazy 2 weeks usually at home. March through June are the glory days. There's times when I do enjoy using a workshop approach in math. So I use it as much as possible. So I'll introduce a topic, use formative assessments and summative assessments, sometimes pre-tests, to put kids into groups, and then they'll rotate through 3 to 4 stations each day. I feel like I get a lot more accomplished within a class. The kids are totally engaged, and this is something that we practice in September and October. We practice rotating from station to station with your materials without talking. When is it appropriate to raise your hand and ask? When is it okay to use the restroom? When is it okay to be talking to your partner? That's all part of boot camp. Then come March through June, I can put up my workshop for the day and you just see it take off. And then that frees me up to work with my groups, small groups. I feel like I get to know the kids a lot better. I can differentiate what I feel so well because I know the kids. If they're in 3 different groups, we're doing fractions, I can have a 5th grade level group, a 4th grade level group, and a 3rd grade level group. And they really don't even know that they're working on different things because they just see what they do when they're with me. And everyone within that group is doing the same thing. And they learn a lot of independence, which kind of goes into a question later when you ask, how do I help prepare them for middle school? Absolutely, with this boot camp. Then this is something I really do believe too, that differentiation is not more. Differentiation is something different. Whether you are teaching a skill that you have to maybe dip into the 2nd or 3rd grade materials because it is too hard, you have to be working towards the same standard in a different way. Make sure you read your IEPs and your GIEPs and you're following the SDIs, which is the specially designed instruction. That's your responsibility. I also use my learning support teacher and my gifted teacher to help me with ideas. So when I know something's coming up, I'll ask my gifted teacher, what do you have that I can use for enriching lines, line segments, and rays? There's some things that everyone's just going to have to do, but then I try to make my practice differentiated. So I do truly believe in differentiation, not every day, but almost every day. And the more you know that your students, the easier it is for you to differentiate because you know what they need. What is the best part about teaching 4th grade? Since I got to hear the K1, 2, and 3 interviews, I really tried to come up with something better for mine, but like everyone else, like this age group just fits for me. I love that I see them come in as 3rd grade, some still very immature little babies. And even though, like I said, they usually don't like me in September and October, but I try to teach them how to be responsible people. We use a lot of I statements. If they forget to bring back something signed, it's not, my mom didn't vote. Well, your mom's not in my class. So we really encourage I statements. I forgot to give it to my mom. Everyone forgets. That's okay. There's a consequence, but it's not, they don't miss recess. I'll kind of talk about that in a little bit about my behavior plans, but you see them go from the small 3rd graders to usually very responsible, respectful, independent thinkers, workers, and learners. These are the main ELA concepts taught in 4th grade. So comprehension, vocabulary, and writing. Comprehension really focuses on fiction and nonfiction texts. And it's the big shift from, instead of teaching kids how to read, now they're reading to learn. So they have to be able to read and comprehend what they're reading, because now they are going to be then using that information in their writing, in their speaking, in their listening. It's very important to expose children to rigorous vocabulary, because a lot of them don't hear it in their everyday lives. I was just giving the PSSA and someone asked me what the word threaten means. In 4th grade, that should be something I feel like you just know from everyday life, but some students aren't exposed to rich vocabulary. Writing, they have to recognize how to write in response to reading. So they read something and then they pull out their feelings and ideas from it and then support it with proof from the text. We really focus still on sentence structure, grammar, using a capital I for I, how to use commas, periods, and being able to write things that are cohesive and actually make sense. We'll read it back to them and say, does this make sense? And sometimes there'll be a jumbled mess and they'll say yes. And so that's when you know that you really need to back up and talk about what is a complete sentence. That's something that they really need to go into 4th grade knowing and learning. Okay, 4th grade students. What are their attitudes like? I feel like in 4th grade, you have the whole spectrum. You have the students that still love school, want to please the teacher, want to do what's right. And you have it the whole way to the kids that are too cool for school, one that will talk back, that will be disrespectful. And I think, again, that's where that September, October boot camp comes in, because you teach them how to be respectful. I teach them that the tone of your voice can totally change how someone reacts to what you say. I didn't get that paper, or I didn't get that paper. May I have that paper? I didn't get one. You must have skipped me. Just using 2 different tones can totally change how someone reacts to how someone interprets and reacts to your comments. That's why with the boot camp, we keep high expectations, and some kids that aren't able to follow with my behavior management system, sometimes they are put on a personalized behavior plan. Where you might check in every half hour. They have a list of goals, and then, you pick a reward for the day. I use 2 behavior management systems. One's Class Dojo, and that kind of goes hand in hand with dealing with parents. Keeping them in the loop is where I feel I'm most successful with parents, because if you do end up having a problem, always addressing it with them, just keeping them in the loop, knowing what's going on, then they're not really surprised if you have to ask them to come in to speak about their child's behavior or their responsibility or their lack of respect. We also use letter charts. So for example, right now the letters are, think spring has sprung, or think spring, and we work backwards. If you forget to, it's responsibility. If you forget to get something signed, if you forget your math things at home, you'll lose a letter. You have to have so many letters at the end, and then we have a reward party at the end of the month where we might play on the Wii, spend some time with some extra recess, do a craft. It's usually like an hour long. You rotate through 3 different stations. That's how we teach them. It's okay to lose a letter. It's okay to forget something 1 time, 2 times, but it can't happen all the time, or else you're not going to have enough letters to get into the party. And I think kind of throughout all of this, I kind of talked about how I prepare for middle school, really being responsible and respectful. Having them switch classes now really helps too, because they have to bring all their materials to whatever room they're going to, just like they would if they had to go to their locker. If they have to go back to their homeroom for something, they lose a letter, and that just teaches the responsibility. We also have them get their agendas initialed each night, because that's an easy way to communicate with parents as well. We write notes, we put reminders in there. Parents also write notes back to us, but we tell, the students have to remember to show it to us so that we see, because we don't personally check. We have an agenda checker who just kind of goes around and makes sure that the agenda is assigned each night. And if there's anything that I didn't get to, if you have any further questions, you can always email me at kelly.shevchik@gslines.net, and I'd be happy to answer any questions or help you in any way possible. Thanks.